Give us some Schellingian wisdom, Chris.
And well, if we're just going to review terms, if I remember correctly, sublime as opposed to the beautiful is a kind of is what was it? It kind of like opened up into the infinite. It kind of like that which lacks form. Right?
Yes.
Or
Exactly.
surpasses it, yeah.
Or surpasses. There we go.
Mhm.
One of the features of it, you can think of it as Freud's oceanic. You know, the whole idea of, going out into a mass, like a beach where you see like a beautiful sunset, the ocean just horizon just continues and continues endlessly, and you feel like, oh, there must be something more than just this piecemeal life. That's the oceanic, right? Am I right about this? I'm not really great with Freud, but I'm pretty sure that kind of feeling of something more that kind of transcends experience would be the oceanic, right?
Yes, though I think Freud tended to value it as less than, like, something less than the accomplishment of egoic repression, and
that tracks with Freud.
Yeah, but it is, I think the oceanic feeling would be something like the sublime. I like that connection.
Yep.
But Freud thought we should avoid it because we risked losing our rationality if we were to approach it, as far as I understand.
I feel like that definitely builds on our sort of the expressed relationship with sublime that we were teasing out last time, right? Like it's it opens up potential heavens and potential hells, right? And it's sort of like amoral or metamoral ground of just like pure creativity, but it's not, but because of like the fact that it's so ultimately surpasses us, like it almost, from the standpoint of like human subjective feeling, it's not necessarily friendly.
Yeah, well, what wasn't the term used a lot in the Old Testament for the experience of God is that of awe, like awe and trembling.
Awe and terror, yeah.
And terror, there we go. And it wasn't necessarily like a positive numinosity, but a kind of dark numinosity before which you were less than the dust at the feet of.
Yeah, I think I remember reading it was something like you approach the throne of God with fear and trembling.
Exactly.
Like the term being used, like you're supposed to inwardly be absolutely petrified of what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think also it sort of teases out this notion that we can potentially unpack here, which is the relationship between the transcendent and the act of surrender. Because I was actually listening. Well, I'll just sort of provide this tidbit and then have it as a seed for conversation. But like, I was just listening to a podcast that involved discussion with Brian Eno, who was a favorite musician / thinker of mine, actually. And he was talking about sort of music as one potential route or means of access to the transcendent, or what we consider a transcendent feeling, transpersonal maybe. And he was noting, sort of theorizing that the other ways that we seem to access the similar transpersonal transcendent feeling are things like what was it? It was sex, drugs, rock and roll, and religion, right? So and all of those, he was sort of putting forward this idea that they involve surrender. They involve sort of like a letting go of trying to impose maybe ego consciousness or impose some sense of like personal subjective ordering on what's happening in order to experience that feeling.
So this plays nicely into Freud's distinction between the ego and the self.
Exactly.
Right. The ego is specifically something concerned with one sense of individual identity as clearly delineated, cut off from the rest of the world. And the word transpersonal, I think, fits in here very nicely because of the experience of ego death, just to use that term kind of broadly, as something that you could potentially get from psychedelic experiences or from music or from religious experiences or what have you. It is a surrender, right, of the ego, and kind of like letting those boundaries break down, and so then that kind of submerges you in the world ocean, right, the oceanic feeling of being kind of just one with things and whatnot, right?
Yeah. So I guess I'm kind of wondering if we are sort of, so I'm seeing this through line in terms of where we're at now, like the past couple episodes, or discussions, what have you, of kind of like sort of fell into talking about the present situation, like after the deconstruction, the deconstructive activities of postmodernism, and kind of a critique of that, and then that sort of spilled into this idea of where's the work of construction, how do you start that, democratizing beauty, and then sort of from there, I think it was Chris that had presented this fundamental divide or fundamental tension between like the false gods that we have now and recovering a notion of some of the absolute ground, or some sort of a metaphysical grounding that we kind of talk about as if it didn't exist, but live our lives as if it did, and what that would look like. So I kind of wonder if it might help to, using that as a jumping off point, like start by defining terms of like what does that absolute ground look like? Is that God? Or like what do we mean when we talk about God? Is that helpful?
Yeah. I like that summary of the trajectory we've been on, and we've kind of we backed our way into the God word through the sublime, and we use the word surrender of the ego to describe what takes place when we encounter something infinite. There's this surrender that occurs, but I think there's also, in relationship to the transcendent, like we must be able to cultivate, or not just cultivate, maybe we can work towards it, but we can also receive it through grace, a different kind of relationship, which wouldn't be one of fear and trembling, but one of gratitude, love, not to be cheesy, but agape, swallowed by the divine, but swallowed in a way that like is enjoyable in some sense, that we reunite with that out of which we came. And we don't have many opportunities for that kind of transcendence, at least. I guess we have surrogate forms of transcendence, right, through sex or through drugs, not to put either of those things down. Those are legitimate pathways to transcendence, but they can be profaned. If they're approached in a sacred way, then of course they will deliver us to the sacred. But in our culture, they're not usually. They're packaged in a different way. But religion, the institution, the cultural institution that's supposed to provide us with the royal road to the transcendent, has been for centuries completely and utterly failing to do so. Right. All of the religious institutions. I mean, I'm not saying there aren't a few instances of it working for some people who pursued paths within the traditions, the world religions, but in large part, these institutions have failed modern people, And so I guess you could say in some ways art picked up some of the pieces as another source of, another source of transcendence that was truly like a sacred, um, a sacred realm that was protected. But even at art became kind of profaned, as we talked about. And so, is there any room for transcendence in science? Not really. You kind of get it with like when they start, waxing about the cosmos, whether it's Carl Sagan or Neil deGrasse Tyson, who doesn't hold a candle to Carl Sagan, of course, but nonetheless, like they start to become theologians. Like when scientists popularize what they do as a sort of cultural story or a worldview, they become theologians. But I don't think that to me doesn't seem like a satisfying source of transcendence either, because ultimately they're telling us to transcend meaning and purpose and the whole idea of like consciousness as having some role in the universe, and say really we're just atoms in motion and stars exploding and stuff. That's what's really going on here. And isn't that beautiful? And it's like, well, it could be, but not if it means that our human lives and our values are a fiction and that are ultimately reducible to this transcendent realm of particles or whatever they think is going on at the base of reality. So,
what you said about institutions failing, I think, is particularly significant. Sorry to cut you off, but
it was time.
I think a lot of what's happened spirituality since probably since the 60s, since the beginning of what you would call the New Age movement. Actually, you could probably back this all the way up to the birth of Protestantism, but this failure of institutions leading to religion, spirituality becoming very, very confined to one's personal journey. Like, okay, that's your thing, but keep it out of everybody else's business. And I mean, I suppose you can go about it that way, it just being something strictly personal that doesn't have anything to do with other people. But isn't it so much more like vivid and real when it does involve other people? You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to go to a concert where I'm the only person in the crowd. You know what I mean? It's that, the sense of community is significant in that kind of thing, right? Because we're very social animals, and this idea that our spiritual journey, if you will, is something that we just engage in when we're at home alone, reading books. That seems very sterilized in comparison, right?
Caritas, charity, the act of reciprocality between others, right?
Yeah, I think another thing I was thinking about when you were talking about the sort of community or communal aspect of sort of religion or a relationship to God is, I guess, like in a couple of ways. But this way, I'll go in this direction. That it seems to me that when like the success or like the power of religious belief, or like this experience of like God moving through a room, is it seems like pretty proportional to the feeling of like mutuality or like a shared experience between people in the congregation or whatever. And I think it's sort of a similar thing at, like you said, like at a concert, or obviously again, like sex is relational, at least anyway. And then the other, so like where that kind of points me to is this idea that that God is like the sort of the underlying essence, or like the underlying truth or belief that multiple people can tap into and share as a feeling. And I kind of wonder that if that's the case, that it's something that can only be accessed or approached as like the like an concept, as like, you know, everyone has this sort of intuition of an essence or an underlying ground or unity, but that only by kind of coming together and sharing an experience and sharing the feeling and then identifying what is underlying the driver of that feeling, the driver of that experience for everyone, can we approach this idea of what the transcendent is in its fullness or its essence, versus like kind of what you're talking about, Keelan, where it's like, you know, individual versions of the good or the beautiful or the divine that don't necessarily apply to everyone. And if it doesn't apply to everyone, then is it really defined? Was that coherent at all? I
mean, it's kind of hard to, you know, define the divine ground, but I think you did a pretty decent job. You know,
That's not me this time.
is that a frog?
Sounds like Luke. Yeah, it's the frogs in the backyard.
That's a sign, you guys.
Welcome to Alabama.
We need to ask the frog. It's trying to impart divine wisdom.
Probably knows more about the subject than I do, if we're being honest.
There's a Zen koan in here somewhere. But yeah, I think I'm curious to hear what Chad and Luke think about where we've gone so far. But I also just wanted to add, there's definitely this social dimension to religion, even though I don't want to, in an effort to emphasize the importance of, you know, collectivity and sociality, and the importance of being together and sharing the sense of the divine. It's essential. In, you know, Protestantism, just to use an example, like loses a lot by sort of pulling away from the rituals where people become of one body, and pulling away from the sense of collectivity toward the individual's relationship to God. I think a lot is lost in there, but there's also a deepening that was opened up by that move, that, you know, this importance of the value of individuality. And I think, you know, Ken Wilber, I don't know if he was the first to do this, but his way of thinking of the divine, you know, as having a first person, second person, and third person dimension, I think is really helpful, just so that we don't fall prey to this exclusive sense that, no, this is what God really is. And it's like, no, we can access God. There's so many channels, you know, and but there is still this sense of unity that you were pointing to, Raymond, of a sense that whatever the divine is, it is whatever is presupposed by the ability we have to even communicate in the first place. It's like, it's the presupposed background of everything else, or it's nothing at all, you know? And so if we're going to look for something that's not already presupposed in our very capacity to look and to share with one another about what we see, we're never going to find it. It's always underneath that. So yeah, but Chad and Luke, I don't know if either of you have been trying to butt in. I just wanted to give you space for a second.
I just have a couple of thoughts. Just, I guess, first of all, I'm going to throw out astrological perspectives a lot here. So feel free to push back or ask for clarification or whatever. But it's fascinating to me that just where we started, that the planetary archetype associated with the transcendent is Neptune. And it also corresponds to the ocean. It's like Poseidon in the Roman or in the Greek. And, you know, and it requires, you know, vulnerability and the capacity to surrender ultimately to genuinely connect with it. But Neptune also corresponds to madness and to escapism and addiction. So like where you're describing like, you know, sex has an authentic capacity to the sublime, but it also has addictive qualities and escapist qualities, just as like anything else that we isn't like, I guess, situated in our understanding of the good or oriented towards that in some way. But yeah, just like the Neptunian aspect of how it's an archetype that, you know, colors and helps us understand these broad ranges of phenomena. And then I guess like my sense of it is that, like, I guess what Raymond was saying is like the connection to the transcendent, or something that how we can all agree upon it, or sense of commonality. And what it made me think about was like maybe the infant's orientation towards its mother. That, like, you know, it's like this sense of like numinosity of like security and connection and belonging that gives meaning to the infant, you know. And maybe this is an idealized childhood or whatever in a good mother situation, but like that feeling sense is somehow what I imagined when I think about like a collective sense of what it is that we can agree upon is God. And somehow that connection to meaning and purpose that transcends to like this numinous source that is kind of awe-inspiring, like a mother is to the infant. That was kind of the image that I got. But you know, ultimately I think astrology allows us to connect back to God, to the transcendent, to an intelligence that transcends all of the cosmos, but informs every individual in a very unique way that we have a ability to identify and connect with and understand ourselves better and understand each other better as to how we're all connected to the whole. So
yeah, I think, you know, astrology is the oldest science or art or whatever. It's part of, you know, the oldest cultural inheritance that we have as a species, as in terms of like the development of consciousness. And it's clearly a language of it's like the wisdom, the language of the wisdom of the sky. And it literally taught us how to count. It taught us how to grow food. The stars, like the motions of the planetary bodies, taught us mathematics and sort of also religion in a way. They taught us how to worship and are, you know, for the primal imagination, clearly potent sources of intelligence that are governing the world, you know. And we've sort of lost that perceptual capacity. We think we're in charge now. In a lot of ways, you know, yeah, we're in charge of the planet Earth in some ways for now. There's a big sort of blowback, rebound coming from our exertion of industrial might that we will face with the, you know, coming ecological catastrophe, or it's already here, I guess. But, you know, there's that shift that took place that removed our or inhibited our capacity to perceive the wisdom of the sky. And, you know, you're one of many modern practitioners who's keeping that tradition alive until we're ready again to like perceive it directly. The symbolism is still so rich, and like, yeah, the way Neptune captures like everything we were talking about, from the sublime to the dissolution into something larger than ourselves, the surrender, the potential for addiction. It's like, yeah, it's all captured in that Neptune archetype. I appreciate that contribution.
I'm wondering if there's something that needs to be added to our understanding of surrender here. Because in listening to Chad talking about astrology, and I was thinking about it earlier. This sense of, I think someone posted in the Discord a while back about how astrology isn't prescriptive. It's not like, oh, this will happen. It's participatory. So there's a kind of both and. It's not a kind of, it's not a, well, to use very religious language, it's not just let thy will be done. You need to prepare to kind of, prepared to be able to listen, or kind of learn how to listen, or in Jung's language, like the fire of God needs a house of stone. You need to build that house of stone. So, and building that house is a container, but it's also an emptying, you're creating the bed chamber through which this encounter with the sublime or with the archetypes or astrological meaning can really be received well. So it seems like surrender isn't a complete annihilation, but a sense of a particular kind of ego strength that's relativized to the self, to use Jungian language, or to God.
Can I riff on what you said as far as like participatory is concerned for a little bit? Is that all right with everybody?
I love that.
I like that a lot. Like, and Matt and Raymond have been talking, about the whole idea of it being not only individual but also collective. This meeting with God or the sublime or whatever you want to call it. I personally would rather refer to it as the sublime, just for me. But as far as this, like, I don't know, almost how beauty is like a vehicle to this sublime thing, where we seem to be ontologically drawn to wanting to experience something outside of ourselves, almost regardless of what it is, like to the point of fanaticism almost. It would seem. Some people would even call us like fanatics about philosophy. We're getting together, posting stuff like this on YouTube. Like, we all go to a certain almost extreme to try and find this thing that is outside of us, seemingly. I don't know if I'm using a correct comparison. I've been trying to like put all this stuff together in my head for the last 30 minutes. But Lacan has this like concept of a void that you get at a certain point in time in your beginning stages of life. Keelan, if I'm misquoting anything, please correct me. But I think this occurs during the mirror stage, if I'm remembering correctly, and you almost like have this, there's just this void that you cannot fill at all. And you try to with whatever you may have, but you identify yourself as an object, at least a little. And we make this attempt to find something outside of ourselves by objectifying ourselves. So if I'm not going to off the cuff here, maybe our attempt at reaching this sublime is the reason we're all seem committed to it is simply because of, from childhood, maybe we were talking about this with Freud and I missed it. From essentially from childhood, we all have this need to fill an objective hole in a subjective being. Wait, did I say that right?
Mm-hmm. It's funny when you were saying
void in an objective being. I think I'm saying that correctly. Yeah, go on, Chris. I'll mute myself.
No, but I can't help but you brought up Lacan, and there's this jouissance in the background, like it was really perfect. I can't help but think about Augustine's like really profound thoughts. He's cornered in the text called Against the Academics. Augustine's cornered by Bartholomew in this text, and Bartholomew is asking, I want the real truth behind God. I want you to give me some certified certainty. You need to do this. I need it. And Augustine said, if you need to look to see this, you'll never see it. It's kind of like in Taoism, right? If you name the Tao, you never know
The Tao
the Tao.
cannot be named.
Exactly.
You can't name the Tao.
But here, what Augustine's saying is that real truth in regards to God is never some, facticity or some experience. Oh, sorry, it is an experience. It's kind of like the trace. It's tracing out. It's the search itself. That is the kind of pursuit of both finding truth and God. And he says this, and Bartholomew is kind of like, well, what do you mean? It's kind of like when you go to do something, like all of us meeting, we get prepared, we get excited, we're all going to join. And the hours kind of unfold as they lead up to this big event, right? And then they finally come together, we're all together, boom, it happens, right? And then these other events that will happen as well. But I kind of like this idea of the trace, this endless pursuit. You may not get to it, but what's more important is the search. It's the pursuit itself, the experience of the pursuit. I don't know, I kind of like that.
Yeah,
I like that a lot.
I feel like there's two things I kind of want to touch on. One, I think goes back to what Chad was saying, and one that important point I think you brought up, Chris, and I'm going to see if I can try to synthesize these two together. We'll see, crash and burn. So Chad, you were sort of mentioning that you were making the connection between the sort of Neptunian aspects of the divine and how that relates to, the oceanic and surrender, but also like this, precarious notion of surrender with regards to like it can also lead to like, overwhelm and addiction and sort of like this hyper attachment to some like divine object. And you were sort of saying that that in some way relates to, or it can be analogized by like an infant's relationship with its mother, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when I heard you say that, I was sort of reminded of the etymology of nature, which relates to natus and natality, right? So it's that which is constantly being born, constantly birthing itself. And we always sort of talk about like Mother Nature or Gaia, right? So that those two things seem intrinsically linked in our sort of collective archetypal abstract feeling about our relationship with nature, right? It's like it's very much a mother-infant relationship.
Right.
I kind of want to try and connect that with what Luke was saying, right, about Lacan, right? So Lacan, as I understand him, big disclaimer there, but the way I understand it is basically the process of becoming a discrete subjectivity for Lacan involves this kind of fissioning off, as it were, from the subjectivity of the mother, the big other, or whatever, right? And that creates this kind of, like Luke was saying, this like primordial wound, which then we try to fill with, whatever we can. And there's that French term, le petit mort, right? This little death, which is orgasm, in which there's this kind of almost returning to that primordial state of kind of pre-subjectification.
It's transcendence again, right?
Right, and
then really get there though, right?
Yeah. Well, because you don't actually try, right? Because what would it be to actually get all the way there would be for your subjectivity to completely dissolve, and that would be the same thing as actually dying, basically. But I think we could connect this to ideas of like ego death too, right? I think there's something there that there's some kind of connection that can thread all that together with what we're saying about this kind of like primordial ocean archetype or what have you.
Yeah, I mean, there's an instinctual transcendence that's just woven into our biology, right? And to the extent that our psychology is, and this, as Freud and Lacan describe it, we separate from the mother to become an individual, and it's a primordial wound, as you're saying, and that drives us to try to heal the wound by finding a lover, and through that relationship, at least for heterosexual couples, like you give birth to new children, and like that's the species drive that is just, yeah, it's like instinctually woven into our psyches. But I think that's a form of biological transcendence right there, but it's also not the extent of the transcendence that we that's in quotes have access to. It's not the ego. I think so the ego is driven by this search for biological transcendence, but we have a higher self of some kind that's able to recognize maybe the necessity of this biological process. Otherwise we wouldn't be here, but that is also open to other possibilities of transcendence that go beneath or above or behind the biological, that aren't separate from the biological, but that out contextualize it in some sense, and that maybe give it a meaning that if you only view it as a biological process, it lacks.
So I guess we're defining biology as that which pertains to the development of organic life, right?
Yeah, and in the human context, what drives us to reproduce,
So I guess that to me, and again, I'll just sort of just sort of add a little bit here and use it as a framework for improvisation. But going back to the idea of like this, again, sort of mothering archetype, birthing process, I think obviously, sexual reproduction and the phenomenon of like perpetuating a species, that sort of thing, is in of itself a repetition, replication, and manifestation of the birthing process. But I think it goes beyond that in like this sort of symbolic sense of considering all of nature, like this cycle of like creativity, sustenance, and destruction that like is constantly moving along through time. I think still is an expression of that archetype of that sort of that constant birthing process. And especially if you consider everything as interrelated, whether we see that as a consequence of branching out from one singularity, or whatever. I guess there's multiple paths to considering the universe or nature as one cohesive and interconnected whole, that like biological or non-biological, that birthing process is still happening. So
yeah, well, I was, as you were speaking, thinking that the biological process symbolizes something.
Yeah.
Right. It's like, maybe that's a question. Does it symbolize something? And maybe some of us, I don't know. I think it does symbolize something.
Yeah, absolutely.
I was wondering if we could just take this just for a second, just veer for 1 second. Is that all right?
Or several minutes. Yeah, it's up to you.
I was thinking we're going to probably have to do 2 episodes on God.
Just 2?
And I'm
what
going
if
to
we
say
just read the freedom essay and like
no, what I want to say is there's a point here that both Ian Hamilton Grant makes and both Schelling makes. And I want to just bring up these 2 points, and then I'll leave it up to all of you. So Ian Hamilton Grant states that the only thing that we could ever know is that we're here right now at the moment. And he calls this predication. So there's a there's an event that happens X, that is the Big Bang. And what happens after the Big Bang, let's call it Y. We're in Y as Y is unfolding.
Yeah.
X is an ancestral event, which we will never experience. And thus we have no, I mean, scientifically speaking, sure, we can, measure certain things with the redshift, we can measure the heating of the universe, we can measure certain things unfolding. But like what he's getting at with this point is a really, really interesting Schellingian point, because for Schelling, the most important thing about mythology is that God's actuality consists in history. And I don't mean history as the dustbin of events. I mean history in regards to mythologies and how these mythologies invoke multiple consciousness on different levels. Look at like Hinduism, for example, the way that the avatars come down through personality, Krishna, or even Christ, or in Islam and in Judaism, how all the prophets had this experience, this mythical experience through their sleep, right? Spinoza makes this point up in his Tractatus as well. The point here is that we've talked about God from the biological sense, we've talked about, the kind of psychoanalytic sense, but really what we have, other than going to like the God principle with bad physics or something, is we have a mythos. All of us are interested in this. We're all interested in the spiritual aspect of what elements kind of unfold our understanding of God, and yet we haven't brought up mythology. And the funny thing about the philosophy of mythology that everyone got wrong, like Hegel didn't misunderstand. Yeah, Hegel was dead. Engels misinterpret this. Marx interpret this wrong. Is that Schelling wasn't saying, look, God lives in history. No, what we get is this actuality in the mythos. Like when you read the Greeks, you're not, Kronos isn't really killing his children. What we're witnessing are the kind of contracting and expanding forces of the cosmos, and we're
Awesome.
looking at how we have, through this expanded consciousness, detailed actuality up until now. And we've lost this mythology. I mean, like Schelling says, like when Christ is nailed to the cross, mythology ends. We kind of have no mythology anymore. I mean, we're slowly getting back to it. And he's not saying that as a Christian point. He's saying we've lost it because, this is it's a sweeping narrative now that just it subsumes everything. So I think we haven't really talked about God within the mythos. I don't know, we can go back to biology in a second, but I just thought that was interesting because we try to scientifically cognize all of these powers, unfolding from the Big Bang, making all these theories. And then we have these religious establishments, these institutions that have kind of put us in these bad, they're not up to date with how we all feel and act and think these days. But there is a kind of grain of divinity within these mythos, is what I'm trying to get at. Anyways.
It brings it to life, almost.
I think so.
Kind of along that, like the mythology almost invokes this, like, I don't know, just like shared understanding.
Right. So I'm not calling, like when Chad was bringing up astrology, and I'm not calling astrology a mythology. I know it's an art and I know it's a science in itself, but that itself, that we've lost this kind of contact with the stars, how we used to cognize the world through that, or we lost certain things that we used to do, festivals. We brought this up in the first episode, that we've lost this kind of mythos that, keeps us together within the community. And I'm going to stop talking now.
I think Dominique, you brought up something.
Yeah, well, it makes Chris, you kind of pulled out and kind of better explicated what I was thinking of when I was listening to Matt talk about the biological process and symbolism. It seemed like there was a emphasis on this kind of future looking, unfolding drive towards the future. And there's part of me that was like, wait, I think there's also this kind of the ever-presentness of the past, of history, which I guess you find in myth, or like just to use like an empirical example, sometimes you walk, or I'll be walking down a street with houses that are 100 years old, and I'm not just experiencing the kind of architecture in front of me, it's a kind of time travel experience, like in a way. I don't quite have much words for that, but there's a sense of you get that with myth, or you get that with this X event from which Y is present now, like the ever creative birth of that like both mother and child are present.
Yeah, the mythology as a mythology is supposed to fill in the content of X that we can never get to that ancestral event. I think that's what you're kind of saying, right?
Would it be the, like, genuine question about Schelling, what would it be the opposite order events? Because I think I would want to put the mythology is an expression of X that helps us connect back to its ever-presentness or something like that.
I think you guys are saying the same thing.
Yeah. No.
We're saying the same thing? Okay.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think you just said it clearly and better stated than I did, but yeah.
Yeah. So the idea is that like mythos is sort of a cultural shorthand, or a poetic sort of aftershock, or capturing of the aftershock of events that we no longer have access to, but can reach back and return to by virtue of like their preservation. It's almost like a fossilization process, right?
Absolutely. It's kind of like we have necessity. Matt was talking about it before about atoms. Like it's so funny because scientists, they're pretty much, they read Lucretius and stop, maybe Democritus, and that's it. They don't read anybody else. But there's this other history going on. There's this other mythos, and it's not just, Christianity. It's everything. It's from the Greeks to the, to the indigenous people. It's everything.
Yeah.
It's a filling in of consciousness, and it's kind of like a world brain.
Yes.
Is that like like the birth, like, because I remember we were talking about birth as like a biological, and there was a longing for some kind of like higher transcendence, and I wonder if myth is like a spiritual birth at like a collective level. So there's that kind of adds to not use the kind of dualities, but like another layer.
Maybe that's what's going on above. In the Catholic tradition with the idea of the virgin birth. It's like birth, it's a biological process, but we say it was a virgin birth, so it's a miracle. It's not merely biological. And there's different ways of interpreting, what does this mean? Do we take it literally, or is this symbolic of something? In the sense that there is that biology itself, the birth and death of the body, human bodies, any bodies, is itself it conveys a deeper meaning that isn't born and doesn't die, but that is eternal, right? And this is captured in myth in the sense that it's like memory. And as you're saying, Chris, the X is not an event we can experience again. We can only remember it. And the problem and the promise of memory is that it's always a repetition of the past in a new context. And so it's changed each time. It's remembered. We don't have access to the original anymore. We only have the reverberation, the echo, but the echo is being, it becomes a morphogenetic process because it never bounces back the same. But that's how memory becomes anticipatory, and that's how it becomes intelligence. That's how we gradually gain more consciousness over this process, the process being like the mythological process, as Schelling described it. The mythological process is the evolution of consciousness as memory becomes intelligent, right?
Yep.
And I guess it seems to me like when you're talking about like morphogenesis and its relationship to memory, that memory sort of starts as a collection and an ordering of the past, and then becomes sort of a design principle for the future. So it's
well put.
It could do not feed my ego.
That was horribly put. I'm sorry, you're kicked out.
Thank you.
You got it. You got it. But there's this kind of traumatic excess that lingers, hovers over the past, that we don't remember it.
But we feel it.
We feel it, and if we don't, then bad things tend to, repeat themselves. I don't know what I'm saying here.
No, you're right. I got you. It's this idea that like, sort of memory is, like the world is contingent upon how we respond to our memory, maybe. So like,
yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No. I was just thinking of I can't believe I'm bringing this up. There's something really profound that Bergson says in Matter and Memory.
What's going with Bergson?
At the static level, like the necessary level, we remember like habits. We remember our basic habits, like how to write our name. But memory for Bergson is more than just identity. It's kind of like this ancient unconscious past that holds together not just the person, but the person's whole kind of unraveling. In German, it's Instracken. It's like a stretching of time.
So you said that bad things happen when we're not adequately connected with that. The how we are birthed out of history and mythology and whatnot, right? So I think like maybe the way that I would frame that is in terms of how mythology and history contextualize us and allow us to orient ourselves, as opposed to us just being, oh, we're just here, we're just thrown out into the world. What do we do? And maybe we can use that to kind of reel us back to the whole God idea, right? Nietzsche, the madman, the death of God. The language he uses to describe that is very apocalyptic, right? Who gave us the sponge with which to wipe away the horizon? Have we not now untethered this earth from its sun? Are we not now falling endlessly? So this idea of orientation seems very important here. And having lost mythology, having lost history in a way as a consequence of that, that seems to play into this kind of process of nihilism in culture, right? And so yes, of course, I think that would result in bad things happening, because then it's just anything goes. We don't know what we're doing anymore, right?
Bad things happen, as in like we go mad when we lose that context, and that's what happened to Nietzsche. But in a weird way, he's actually, I think, a profoundly Christian figure, in the sense that he's reminding us that Christ was nailed to the cross and God is dead, and this mythological process is over. Now we are in a different phase of our human evolution, and we need to take a new kind of responsibility. Nietzsche didn't have the cultural context or support or help to move that project forward. He announced it way earlier than anyone was ready for it, right? Now here we are trying to carry that forward.
It should have been called the Untimely Meditations. That should have been called the Untimely Meditations.
It kind of reminds me of, I must be misremembering. If anyone remembers better, please correct me. But like the part in Thus Spake Zarathustra that Jung points out when Nietzsche loses the battle is when Zarathustra asks Nietzsche to eat a frog, Luke, and he says no. He says he refuses, and I think Jung connects that with his inability to kind of be a creature, to kind of accept creaturehood, or that one isn't identical with the self. That one that's so.
Yeah, he lies down with his animals.
I forget where I was going with that.
No, but you're right. He lies down with his animals. and you assume that Zarathustra dies, or, man, it's been so long since I've read that text. I think that's the last scene, right?
It's probably been longer since I've read that text for me. Keelan, you're the nature scholar here.
I never even finished that book.
Wait, what?
I got like halfway through it.
I hope
like,
your
I can't
fourth
do
year
this.
teacher
Sorry.
isn't hearing that. He did what?
Yeah. Oh man.
Well,
oh, sorry. Go ahead, Matt.
I'm gonna have to run to dinner here in a few
Oh,
minutes.
geez, it's 7 o'clock.
But I feel like that this is a really wonderful place to kind of wrap it up. We don't have to finish this instant.
I need to wrap up just
Chad.
a little bit. Because like what you said, Chris, was really helpful. In that, like, you know, recovering myth, and like actually astrology, it's grounded on myth. Like when you mentioned Kronos, like that's Saturn. And like, you know, the story of him eating his children, it's just part of the archetype of the Saturnian archetype of like restriction and negativity and like restraint and holding back the forces of life in essence. But like, that's what, again, the astrological perspective actually recovers, is genuine myth. Like not, I mean, it's the same mythology, the same stories that we initially intuited back in ancient Greece, but like it connects it directly to us, not like in an abstract way. It's a lived experience. It's something you feel in our essence. And like how Plato was describing, like like anamnesis, or like memory is a recollective process. I feel like that's, I mean, whether or not we actually incarnate or not, I mean, it's actually, you can bracket that and say that access to the archetypal realm is something that we have individually, and is a capacity to access memory that transcends us. Like I'm a Taurus, but like there's so much wisdom in the sign that, I mean, that's not even something we generally work with. It's generally planetary archetypes, but like even like the signs, it has a wisdom in it that I can connect to, I can meditate on, I can reflect on my experience and connect with it and learn. I can learn more about myself. And you see what I'm saying? It's a way of actual access. But then I want to say one more thing, is that like it's the process of differentiation in the modern era, and like what you were saying originally or earlier, Dominique, about surrender and openness. And like I'm listening to Ian McGilchrist, the master and the emissary, and he's talking about right brain and left brain and the capacity to know things. It's like you need the right brain or the left brain to like shut down. It's like desire to pin things down and categorize everything. It needs to open up and be more vulnerable, or have, but basically I think he's saying that like left brain is too dominant in the modern era, and we've lost that connection to the right brain, which we really need in certain ways. But like ultimately what I was pointing towards is that like, the 400 years of the Copernican revolution and Descartes and the differentiation of the modern mind and the disenchantment of the cosmos. And then fundamentally important is the discovery of the 3 outer planets that we didn't have an astrological paradigm before now. And it wasn't until the discovery of Pluto in 1930 that allows us to fully grok, and it's not complete, but to have a more fully comprehensive understanding of the pantheon, and it connects us to the depth of who we are. And like we had to go through this process and separate and forge the autonomous nature and go through Kant that gives us that division of the mind and the whole. Whereas prior to this whole process, you were still beholden to the gods. You were still so enmeshed in the astrological paradigm. We didn't have differentiation of independent agency in the way that we do now, after we've eclipsed that reality and discovered the 3 outer planets. And it's the potential to connect back now after that differentiation that is so exciting to me, that I think can help us get out of the meaning crisis and like provide a framework for discussing philosophy and psychology that's not abstract. It's not it's something that's grounded in the empirical understanding of where the planets are in our birth charts and in the sky. Does that make sense?
Totally makes sense.
I think Owen Barfield would agree.
This was our best. This was our best episode, I think.
Yeah, it's all downhill
Hands
from
down.
here. So what we might be able to do then next time, I think, Chris, you're talking about like a God part 2, and we can ostentatiously
By the way,
call it that.
no, we're democratic here. It's not just what I say goes. We do what what everyone wants to do.
I got you. I wasn't saying that was a sort of a an autocratic decree or anything.
I am the big head of Oz, the bald head of Oz. Sorry.
But basically, I was trying to think of like, okay, well, we're kind of like constructing or suggesting this through line of like postmodern reconstruction. And so I'm kind of wondering that, we've got a lot of the seed ground from a biological perspective, from a psychological perspective, from a mythopoetic perspective, from the perspective of like, lived experience, as Chad was saying, of like divinity or godness or sublimity that we've been working towards like the past couple of times. I kind of wonder maybe if the next time we can perhaps synthesize and converge and essentialize some underpinning of divinity or the absolute or the sublime that we've been kind of teasing out and dancing around, and go the other direction of like starting from there, backing out what Chad was saying with regards to like the recovery of meaning, or I guess in a Nietzschean sense, like the sort of like a post-Christian or post-God recovery of the spiritual, or recovery of meaning or the divine, like some sort of creative constructing process. And is that something you guys are interested in? Am I just speaking gobbledygook? I'm not sure.
After the death of God, after nihilism, then what?
What then?
Yes, exactly. ... question mark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
sounds good.
I'm down.
Awesome.
Do it.
Like a plan.
Cool.